Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Somewhere You Feel Free, Tom Petty and Los Angeles, by Christopher Mckittrick, narrated by Gary Bennett. Prologue. Who knows where they are from? After claiming in interviews during the Heartbreakers' 40th anniversary tour that it would be his band's last full-scale tour, Tom Petty departed the stage of the Hollywood Bowl on September 25, 2017, the final show of the 5-month celebration of the band's incredible history. Mike Campbell, the Heartbreakers' lead guitarist and bandmate of Petty's since they were both 20 years old, was doubtful, telling Rolling Stone in a June 2017 story presciently titled Inside Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers' Last Big Tour, "I've been hearing that for 15 years. We'll see." It certainly wasn't the first time that Petty had talked about scaling back the band's touring schedule, but this being another false declaration, or a cynical marketing ploy, seemed less likely than before. For one, Petty was finally starting to look his age, moving across and off the stage that night with a noticeable limp. The 66-year-old band leader was not known for being particularly acrobatic on stage since the Heartbreakers' late 1970s run to superstardom, but footage from the Hollywood Bowl concerts shows a Petty whose performances are every bit as powerful, if not more reserved in movement. Still, like Campbell, the Los Angeles audience had reason to doubt Petty's words about the finality of touring, particularly on the Heartbreakers' home turf. Even when touring Europe, Petty never seemed far from Southern California. Most of the Heartbreaker tours either began or ended at venues not far from Petty's Malibu home, and almost half of the dates played on Petty's previous tour with Mudcrutch, his before-he-was-famous band that he revived in 2008, had been in the Golden State. Many of Petty's older musical heroes, like Bob Dylan and Byrds bassist Chris Hillman, whose album Bidin' My Time was produced by Petty and released on September 22nd, the day of the second of Petty's 3 Hollywood Bowl concerts, still maintained active touring schedules. In fact, shortly after the Heartbreakers ceased serving as Dylan's backup band in October 1987, Dylan embarked on a touring cycle critics and fans have dubbed the Never-Ending Tour. By Dylan's standard, the Heartbreakers were practically in semi-retirement already. Sadly, that 3rd Hollywood Bowl show was indeed the final concert by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Petty died at the UCLA Medical Center in Santa Monica, California, on October 2, 2017, the consequence of an accidental overdose of pain medication he had been prescribed, in part to treat knee and hip issues that plagued him before and during that final tour. At a cursory glance, an artist with the voice of Tom Petty, both in terms of his artistic voice and the unmistakable northern Florida inflection in his vocals, seems like an odd fit for Los Angeles, especially when one has the erroneous point of view that the Heartbreakers' music falls under the umbrella of Southern rock, or, even more off-base, whatever critics mean by the label Heartland rock. When Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers released their self-titled first album on November 6, 1976, nobody quite knew what to make of them. The Los Angeles-based band didn't fit comfortably in any of the categories of music popular in 1976. Petty certainly didn't look or sound like a hard rocker, and the band didn't sound like punk, even if they were a bunch of skinny 20-somethings in casual dress and leather jackets. Their songs certainly weren't disco or arena rock or anything that involved prominent synthesizers. Nonetheless, the Billboard review of their debut album dismissed Petty on one hand as another punk rock, black leather-jacketed offshoot, while on the other stating that the album gains impact on its second spin. In the opening line of his review of the album for Rolling Stone, famed rock critic Dave Marsh asked, "Who knows where they are from?" He went on to say in his short comments that no part is particularly special. Songs, singing, playing are all kind of primordial LS rock, like Love or The Seeds. Still, he followed that lukewarm criticism with an extremely prophetic line. But it's such a 60s throwback, you can't help but fall in love. It demonstrated that the only people who really thought of the Heartbreakers as punk didn't actually listen to the record. The desire of the establishment to put any label other than rock and roll on the Heartbreakers' music makes it no surprise that Petty, in the cover story of the November 1977 edition of Backdoor Man magazine, declared the oft-repeated line, "Call me a punk and I'll fucking cut you." It even became the article's subtitle. Petty continued, "I'm fucking serious. I don't fuck around. From the beginning, I think because I have a leather jacket on the album sleeve, they called me a punk. Don't fucking call me one. I don't like that. I ain't joining nobody's club. I've got my own club. I'm in a rock and roll band." Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers was released by independent label Shelter Records and distributed by ABC Records, which by then was in the first stages of being on its last legs. The label would be sold to MCA Records in 1979, leading to the first of Petty's many battles with record labels. As a result, the album received little promotion stateside. The Heartbreakers were not a magic combination that instantly unlocked music industry success for Petty. The band's 1976 debut was mostly overlooked. In contrast, Petty's stablemate on Shelter, Dwight Twilley, had a top 20 hit with his band's debut single, I'm on Fire, which peaked at number 16 in August 1975, before the Dwight Twilley Band had even recorded an album. The Heartbreakers didn't have the same luck. Of the singles from the self-titled debut album, only Breakdown charted in the U.S., crawling to number 40 in February 1978. That nominally gave the group its first U.S. Top 40 hit, but it utilized every bit of industry clout that ABC's vice president of album promotion John Scott had, in a Herculean effort. The album wasn't certified as a gold record by the Recording Industry of America until January 1988, almost a dozen years after it was released. Yet, just a few years later, more people would have heard the Dwight Twilley Band's Phil Seymour singing background vocals on Breakdown and American Girl than on any Dwight Twilley Band album. That Petty and the Heartbreakers survived and later thrived is doubly impressive, viewing their collective accomplishments through the changing face of Los Angeles and the entertainment industry as a whole. One doesn't need much of a deep dive on Tom Petty to realize that Los Angeles is the only place that could have produced a musician like him and a band like the Heartbreakers, which was formed from the remnants of Petty's Gainesville band Mudcrutch. Los Angeles had molded Petty before he and fellow Mudcrutch member Danny Roberts and roadie Keith McAllister crossed the Florida state line on their way to Hollywood in pursuit of a record deal in 1974. Petty's childhood in Gainesville, Florida, has been extensively documented, often focusing on his difficult relationship with his father, his teenage years playing in a variety of successful local cover bands, and his crowning youthful achievement of establishing Mudcrutch, the locally famous band that drew hundreds to its music festival-like performances at the farm where the band crashed, affectionately called the Mudcrutch Farm. While Petty was shaped by his early years in northern Florida, he was also molded by the mid-century pop culture that he consumed. Born at the dawn of the 1950s, Petty was a child of the television age. In an interview for Petty, the biography, Petty recalled being enchanted by the idealism of Los Angeles at an early age. "What I did come to notice was that everything really great seemed to be coming from California," remembered Petty. The television announcers would say, "From Television City in Hollywood, it's the Red Skelton Show." And I thought, Television City? Man, that's where I need to be. This is when I was still a little kid. Television turned me on to a whole different idea of living, and I was a sponge. But pretty soon you start wondering if there isn't something between what you see on television and the shit you're dealing with at home. He also said, "I knew I didn't want to grow up and be an insurance salesman. That looked really dull to me, and I think it was television that saved my life, that raised and educated me." Petty also developed a deep love for movies, especially older ones from the golden age of Hollywood. In later life, he claimed to have watched 3 or 4 movies a day, and, while touring, preferred staying in hotels that offered the Turner Classic Movies channel on their televisions. It seems incredibly appropriate, then, that Petty's first of many encounters with a rock and roll icon happened not through a jukebox or at a concert, but on a movie set. While those early glimpses of Hollywood on television had grabbed Petty's interest, Petty was really bitten by the entertainment bug in one of the most mythological ways possible, by meeting Elvis Presley on a movie set when Petty was 10 years old. As if to push fact into an even more unbelievable territory that rock and roll legend occupies, the title of the movie Elvis was filming was 1962's Follow That Dream. I've always thought it was a cosmic title, Petty would later say in conversations with Tom Petty. How the preteen Petty came to encounter the king of rock and roll seems like a setup to a Hollywood screenplay. Petty's uncle, Earl Jernigan, regularly helped scout locations for filmmakers working in Florida. Jernigan had scouted the courthouse in Ocala, Florida, about 40 miles south of Petty's hometown of Gainesville, for a scene in Elvis's movie. Jernigan's wife, Petty's Aunt Kitty, asked the boy if he'd like to go on a trip to meet Elvis, and Petty went without really knowing who Elvis was. Whenever an impressive-looking man walked by, Petty asked his aunt if that was Elvis. Finally, the man himself appeared. In a piece Petty wrote for Esquire decades later, he recounted of that moment. When I met Elvis, we really didn't have a conversation. I was introduced by my uncle, and he sort of grunted my way. What stays with me is the whole scene. I'd never seen a real mob scene before. I was really young and impressionable. Elvis really did he looked sort of not real, as if he were glowing. He was astounding, even spiritual. With this combined taste of rock stardom and Hollywood, Petty saw his future. Shortly thereafter, he traded his Whammo slingshot for a box of Elvis 45s. 3 years later, Petty would receive another cosmic nudge when he saw the Beatles make their American debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, and realized that if he could get a few guys from the neighborhood together to play in a band, they could be rock stars like the four young men on television. That was when the world turned to color from black and white. All of a sudden, Technicolor, Petty said in an interview with Billboard in 2005. I was 13 or 14, and knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life, no question. It still baffles me a little bit as to why the lightning bolt hit me, but it did. Once Petty was firmly entrenched in the Gainesville music scene, Los Angeles became even more of a draw to him, as it was the place where fellow local musicians with substantial talent had gone to find their fortunes. The 1960s and early 1970s Gainesville scene, which revolved around the University of Florida, proved to be remarkably fertile. Stephen Stills may have taken a roundabout way to get there, but both Buffalo Springfield and Crosby, Stills and Nash were formed in Los Angeles. Bernie Leadon had become a member of the Flying Burrito Brothers, and a founding member of the Eagles in Los Angeles. Even Tom Leadon, 2 years Petty's junior, and a one-time member of Mudcrutch, had made it to Los Angeles and was playing in Linda Ronstadt's band. These musicians spent years cutting their teeth in Gainesville, and were now writing and performing hit records. It was all Petty wanted, and he knew that to do it, he too would have to go to Los Angeles. Ironically, but not surprisingly considering the well-documented crooked history of the entertainment industry and the music industry in particular, Los Angeles record labels became both the key to Petty's music dreams and one of his biggest obstacles. He had several well-known major battles with the music industry, some of which became first-paragraph mentions in his obituaries. Famously, he declared bankruptcy to get out of his first record contract. Later went on to battle with his label when they wanted to release his 1981 album Hard Promises with a premium price tag, and even released a single to radio about how disappointing radio had become under expanding corporate ownership. He was an agent of change that fought against rising concert ticket prices and lamented the direction of MTV, a channel whose popularity he helped develop with his imaginative music videos. But he also had other pet peeves with the industry that clearly bothered a man whose public image seemed to be laid back and carefree. The same supposedly laid-back man who declared, "Call me a punk and I'll cut you." Whatever the public thought of Petty based on the image he portrayed on stage, in music videos, and in interviews, those who knew him best never considered him laid back. As he confessed in conversations with Tom Petty, "My kids have this huge laugh about me. I just spent some time with them, and they were laughing about my image. They said, 'The world pictures you as this laid-back, laconic kind of person, and actually you're the most intense, neurotic person we've ever met.' That's kind of true. You're not always what people picture you as." One of those peeves that Petty certainly wasn't laid back about was a long-running dispute he had with the Los Angeles Times for not ranking the Heartbreakers highly on a 1988 list titled LA's Greatest Rock and Roll Band. Who is it? In Petty's recollection, which he shared in an interview with the Los Angeles Times in 2014, the newspaper had erroneously claimed that the Heartbreakers were ineligible because the band had formed in Florida. He took particular umbrage with the list because the lead singer of the band ranked number 1, Jim Morrison of The Doors, was also from Florida. In Petty's estimation, points were being unfairly deducted from his band. However, Petty's recollection wasn't entirely accurate. The Heartbreakers were indeed included on that 1988 list, but the band had been ranked 8th between Little Feat and Love. While Petty and nearly all of the original Heartbreakers hailed from Florida, the exception being bassist Ron Blair, a Navy brat born in San Diego who later lived in Gainesville, the Heartbreakers did not form until 1976 at the Village Recording Studio in West Los Angeles. And though Petty and the Heartbreakers pianist Ben Montench and guitarist Mike Campbell had also played in Mudcrutch in Florida, in Petty's estimation the Heartbreakers was a separate band entirely from Mudcrutch, and, thus, a child of the Los Angeles music scene. But the Heartbreakers understood that their lack of Van Halen flash may have been held against them in the late 70s and early 80s Los Angeles music scene. As Tench carped to BAM magazine back in 1978, "You're only an LA band if you go and hang out on the strip a lot, and make a big deal of pointing out to people that you hang out on the strip a lot. We're not into that." Petty certainly considered the Heartbreakers' place in music firmly within the California rock tradition. "I think maybe if we were gone, God forbid, there would be a different take on us," he said in a 2006 interview with Rolling Stone. "Because this group is really the last link to that whole California thing, to the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, and that whole era of music that came along. This is probably the last thing that attaches to that." In the same period, he spoke about the unfairness in conversations, adding, "We love the Byrds, and we love the Beach Boys, and Buffalo Springfield and the Burrito Brothers, and we kind of felt we belonged here in L.A., and we always have, though we're still never referred to as an L.A. band. We're always referred to as a Southern band. But the truth is, every bit of music we've ever made was in L.A. We've been in L.A. for over 30 years. We're a Los Angeles band." By that time, there were few people left who would argue against Petty's assessment. In 2010, Petty expressed his disappointment directly to the Los Angeles Times that his group was often left out of these assessments. "I think we're really Californians. I've been in California longer than I was in Florida. Certainly where you grow up is always going to be deeply embedded in your soul. I don't know, but sometimes it kind of hurts my feelings that we're not included in discussions of Southern California music. The Heartbreakers formed here. We really are an LA band." While the Los Angeles media and some rock critics might have initially excluded Petty and the Heartbreakers from the Southern California rock pantheon, area fans embraced Petty as a Los Angeles icon. Chapter 1. There's Something Happening Here. The modern recording history of Los Angeles began in 1942 with the founding of Capitol Records by songwriters Johnny Mercer and Buddy DeSilva, along with Glenn Wallachs, owner of famed record store chain Wallachs Music City, whose flagship store was in Hollywood. Capitol's original offices were located upstairs in the Wallachs Music City building. While recording studios and small record labels had existed in Los Angeles prior to Capitol Records, the company headquarters, which remains an iconic part of the Hollywood skyline, came to symbolize the shift of the music industry's base from New York City to Los Angeles. Each of the three men entered the partnership with considerable success. While Mercer had yet to pen In the Cool, Cool, Cool of the Evening, Moon River, or Summer Wind, and had not yet won the first of his 4 Academy Awards for Best Original Song. By that time, he was already an established songwriter who had moved from New York City to Hollywood the previous decade to write songs for RKO Studios. His credits include what could be considered the anthem of Tinseltown, Hooray for Hollywood, which appeared in the 1937 Warner Brothers film Hollywood Hotel. Buddy DeSilva, 15 years Mercer's senior, had also been a celebrated New York City songwriter who had worked with iconic figures like Al Jolson, George Gershwin, and Lou Brown before heading to Hollywood to produce films. At the time of the founding of Capitol Records, he was an executive producer at Paramount Pictures. Wallach's Music Store was known for popularizing several record store innovations, such as sealing records in cellophane, placing records in waist-high bins that made browsing them easier for customers, and listening booths. On the retail level, Wallach's understood how to sell records better than just about anyone else in the United States. By the 1940s, Hollywood had long been the home of the film industry, and in spite of the popularity of popular music and film since Al Jolson introduced the sound era in 1927's The Jazz Singer, there are no major record labels based in Los Angeles. With their backgrounds, Mercer, DeSilva, and Wallach's recognized the potential that a major record company could have in the entertainment capital of the world. Capitol Records ended up a runaway success, and the three men's gambit paid off. By 1955, Capitol Records was one of the industry's heavyweights and was acquired by British record company EMI for $8.5 million. Shortly thereafter, EMI began construction on the Capitol Records building in Hollywood that would later be dubbed the sound capital of the world because of the famed studio's prominence in popular music. The circular building and its 151-foot spire became an instantly recognizable landmark of Hollywood. Similar to how the film industry gradually moved much of its operations from New York City to Los Angeles from 1910 to 1930, the 1940s and 1950s saw a rapid increase in record labels of all sizes planting roots in Los Angeles. Many of the labels had corporate ties to the major film studios. American Decca Records, which bought into Universal Pictures in 1945, took full control of Universal Pictures in 1952, creating a powerhouse media company. Decca and MCA would merge in 1962 to create an even larger company. MGM would establish MGM Records in 1946, and Disney established Disney Music Group in 1956. United Artists would establish its own United Artists Records in 1957. Warner Brothers Records was established in Burbank in 1958, and 20th Century Fox Records was established the same year. The rapid expansion didn't stop there. Even Motown, a label distinctly associated with Detroit, would move much of its operations to Los Angeles by 1972. In addition to these conglomerates, the Los Angeles landscape became dotted with dozens of independent record labels and recording studios. The proliferation of labels, studios, and performance spaces led to young musicians heading to Los Angeles to make it. By the mid-1960s, Los Angeles had birthed a music scene that would produce famous groups like the Byrds, the Mamas and the Papas, the Doors, and Buffalo Springfield, as well as a burgeoning club scene in the area of what became known as the Sunset Strip in Hollywood, later West Hollywood, that would host decades of rock stars on its stages. All of these venues soon learned that by catering to popular musicians' every need, on stage, off stage, or in studio, they could count on repeat business from repeat clientele. In late 1966, the Sunset Strip area became subject to strict regulations, including a 10 o'clock p.m. curfew on the clubs, after locals complained that the district had been a haven for youth drinking, drug use, loitering, and noise. To protest the curfew, organizers called for a rally at Pandora's Box, a popular club located at the corner of Sunset Boulevard and Crescent Heights Boulevard that was owned by KRLA disc jockey and later Shindig host Jimmy O'Neill for the evening of Saturday, November 12, 1966. Pandora's Box had become the prime target for locals, even though it did not serve alcohol on its premises. That initial protest, which reportedly attracted about 1,000 demonstrators, kicked off several weeks of unrest in the area that resulted in dozens of arrests and were later dubbed the Sunset Strip Riots. In the aftermath of the first few weeks of almost nightly demonstrations, the Los Angeles City Council purchased Pandora's Box with the intention of closing and demolishing it, which it did the following year. In those weeks, the demonstrations had already begun to be mythologized in the media. Buffalo Springfield recorded, "For What It's Worth," "Stop, Hey, What's That Sound?" in early December 1966 as a narrative of the demonstrations, and it was released before the end of the year. Stills performed the song for the first time publicly on Christmas Day 1966 on the stage of the reopened Pandora's Box during its final night of operations. For What It's Worth would soon become a top 10 hit and the counterculture anthem of the late 60s. Showing their understanding of Southern California music history, the Heartbreakers regularly covered the song during their 1987 U.S. tour, and Petty performed it alongside members of Buffalo Springfield after his speech inducting the band into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1997. March 1967 saw the release of Riot on Sunset Strip, a low-budget exploitation movie released by B-movie distributor American International Pictures, featuring the title song performed by Los Angeles garage band legends The Standalls, best known for their hit Dirty Water, which the Heartbreakers would also cover a handful of times decades later. Though significantly embellished, the film did help to add to the idea of Hollywood being a haven for counterculture musicians. In fact, Riot on Sunset Strip was one of the first of several low-budget exploitation films released in the late 60s to depict hippie culture. Yet even those who contributed to the myth of the Sunset Strip riots admitted that the name was a result of media hype, with Stephen Stills telling the Los Angeles Times in 2007, "Riot is a ridiculous name. It was a funeral for Pandora's Box, but it looked like a revolution. Indeed, it became clear that the Sunset Strip riots became just one of the growing number of youth counterculture protest movements that would go hand in hand with pop music culture for the rest of the decade." The soon-to-be iconic Rainbow Bar and Grill opened in April 1972, and the Roxy Theater opened in September 1973, as the Los Angeles music scene in the early 70s shifted from the famous Laurel Canyon sound and psychedelic rock of the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, The Doors, and Love, as represented by Pandora's Box and the Whisky A Go-Go, and gave way to singer-songwriters like Neil Diamond, James Taylor, Carly Simon, Joni Mitchell, and Randy Newman, who all helped establish the Los Angeles club Troubadour as one of the country's premier music venues. Though many of those musicians were very much in the same tradition as, and contemporaries of, the Byrds and Crosby, Stills and Nash, by the mid-70s much of what represented the late 60s in California rock was gone, or had moved on, in the wake of the Manson family murders in Southern California, and the disastrous Altamont Speedway Free Festival in Northern California, both in the latter half of 1969. Buffalo Springfield, The Doors, the Byrds, and the Mamas and the Papas had broken up due to deaths or infighting. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young were on hiatus after touring arenas and stadiums in 1974, while the Eagles had their first #1 album with 1974's One of These Nights, and were well on their way to becoming rock and roll powerhouses with the addition of Joe Walsh and the release of their Greatest Hits and Hotel California. Even the Beach Boys, who served as influential predecessors to the entire Los Angeles scene, were rapidly establishing their position as America's favorite nostalgia band, with the 1974 release of the Endless Summer compilation and its 1975 follow-up, Spirit of America. The vocal-driven, folk psychedelic rock combination that had marked the era had all but vanished, leaving Elektra Asylum Records artists like Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, and Warren Zevon as the remaining products of the movement. This was the world that Petty, Roberts, and McAllister entered when they arrived in Los Angeles in 1974, with Mudcrutch's demo in hand. They had left Gainesville with a list of addresses for record companies taken out of Rolling Stone. The band, at the time consisting of Petty, Campbell, Tench, Roberts, guitars and vocals, and Randall Marsh, drums, having reached their limit in Gainesville, made the decision to head west. Petty first attempted to land a deal with Georgia-based
Sample complete. Ready to continue?